see you. And for those of you that I have not met before, I know we've got 26 folks on this call, so that's good. Thank you all for attending today's very important briefing on the state of affairs in Sri Lanka, particularly as it relates to civil rights and human rights abuses and the current proceedings at the UN Human Rights Council. You know, we continue to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic here in the United States. But in spite of that, I appreciate you folks joining us virtually for today's briefing because, especially to our esteemed panelists, I know some of you are in Sri Lanka, some are in the UK. This is not something we could have easily done in the past, rather than in-person briefings. As many of you know, as Danny just told you, I am proud to co-chair the Congressional Caucus on Ethnic and Religious Freedom in Sri Lanka with my good friend and colleague, Danny Davis. We just recently re-registered the caucus for the 117th Congress, so we're fully up and running. And as many of you know, the focus of the caucus is to increase the awareness and educate other members of Congress on the importance and urgency of protecting the rights and identity of all ethnicities and religions in Sri Lanka, many of whom are being excluded from society, the economy, and political life through discrimination, harassment, persecution, and even violence. When Representative Davis and I formed the caucus back in 2013, Sri Lanka was oppressively governed by Mahinda Rajapaksa. Starting in 2015, when Rajapaksa was defeated by Sirisena, the Sirisena government offered short-lived hope and some, although very slow, progress on issues of transitional justice and government accountability. So it's extremely disheartening to once again be learning of new and increased human and civil rights abuses against ethnic and religious minorities, with the Rajapaksa brothers once again controlling the Sri Lankan government. Their re-election raised serious concerns that progress in transitional justice reform would be in jeopardy. Concerns that have been devastatingly realized, with the Rajapaksa government even announcing its withdrawal from commitments the Sirisena government agreed to when Sri Lanka co-sponsored Resolution 30/1 at the UN Human Rights Council in 2015. As you may know, the UN Human Rights Council is currently in session. A new and very troubling report on Sri Lanka's deteriorating human rights situation by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is expected to be debated. With the recent announcement by the Biden administration that the United States will re-engage the Human Rights Council, I am hopeful that the United States will work with our international partners to ensure that a strong resolution on Sri Lanka will be considered during this session. Although not currently a voting member, the United States has proven to be a leader in applying appropriate international pressure on Sri Lanka's government concerning human and civil rights abuses. So the outlook is grim, and I look forward to hearing a debate on the current human rights situation in Sri Lanka from our esteemed panelists, in addition to their perspectives on related proceedings at the Human Rights Council meetings. So thanks again for joining us today, folks. Let me now turn it back over to my friend, Representative Danny Davis, for his opening remarks, and he'll introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Representative Johnson. And let me tell you, Bill, it is indeed a pleasure to be working with you and to continue the action that we've been engaged in now for more than a decade. So we both managed to hang on, hang in, hold on, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. Since the ending of the civil war in Sri Lanka nearly 12 years ago, there are reconciliation issues that continue to be unresolved. The issue of human rights abuses is still before the UN Commission for Human Rights, and holding the Sri Lankan government accountable has not offered meaningful change for the Tamil people and their quest for justice. The Sri Lankan government made promises in 2015 through the Human Rights Council, HRC, under the aegis of Resolution 31, 2015, to promote reconciliation, accountability, and human rights to war survivors and the international community. Some analysts have reported that the current president of Sri Lanka and his enablers appear to willingly choose a path toward authoritarian governance over the people. This seize of power would make it difficult to continue to practice democracy, uphold human rights, allow freedom of religion, and equality for ethnic minorities, regardless of race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, and religion. No one should be excluded within a society. The economy and political life through discrimination, harassment, persecution, and all manner of injustices, not only in Sri Lanka, but anywhere in the world. Just last year, we lost one of our great statesmen and civil rights leader, U.S. Congressman John Lewis. He said, and I quote, "Freedom is not a state, it is an act. It is not some enchanted garden perched high on a distant plateau where we can finally sit down and rest. Freedom is the continuous action we must do its part to create an even more fair and more just society." Today, we will hear from our distinguished panel to share more information and knowledge on preventing ethnic and religious exclusion, human rights abuses, and rise in authoritarianism in Sri Lanka. Now I'm going to introduce our panelists, and I will do them all, and they will follow in this order. The Most Reverend Noel Emmanuel, Bishop of Trincomalee, former Christian Noel Emmanuel was appointed as bishop in the Eastern Province in 2015. The bishop was ordained a priest in 1986 and has served as parish priest, head of catechism, and professor at the seminary, vicar and bursar of the same diocese. Between 1999 and 2001, he studied at the Pontifical Urban University in Rome. Ms. Sharon Shreen Sharar, Director of the Women's Action Network, Mana Sri Lanka Shreen. She is the Director of the Women's Action Network in Manar in 2010, which aims to nurture young women leaders to overcome the socio-cultural inequalities that prevent women from exercising their citizenship. Mr. V. Rajay, General Secretary, British Tamils Forum. Mr. Ravikumar helped form the British Tamil Forum, BTF, in 2006 to seek rights and justice for the Tamils living in Sri Lanka. Professor Beth Van Shank. Beth Van Shank is visiting professor in human rights at the Stanford University Law School and a facility affiliate with Stanford Center for Human Rights and International Justice. We will now begin with Reverend Noel Emmanuel, and Representative Johnson will then handle the question and answer period of our conversation. Reverend Emmanuel.
Thank you. Am I audible enough?
Yes.
Thank you. Congressman, panel speakers and participants, first of all, I thank you for inviting me to be a panel speaker and to take part in this discussion. And my topic is ethnic and religious exclusion or discrimination in Sri Lanka. To start with, I would like to mention about whatever that is said in the Sri Lankan Constitution about religion. Chapter 3 under fundamental rights. Number 10, every person is entitled to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, including the freedom to have or to adopt the religion or belief of his choice. It is also said, no citizen shall be discriminated against on the grounds of race, religion, language, caste, sex, political opinion, place of birth, or any one of such grounds. Basing on this, I enter into the detail of ethnic and religious communities living in Sri Lanka. I mix these two together because they are very much interconnected. So with regard to ethnicity, we have Tamils, Sinhalese, and Muslims and Burghers living in Sri Lanka. Sinhalese being the majority, 74% of the population, Tamils 18%, and Muslims 7%. And we have four major religions: Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam. And Buddhists, they are the majority, 69%, Hindus 15%, Islam 7%, and Christians, Christianity 8%. And this is not the recent statistics, but still that gives some picture about the whole situation with regard to religion and ethnicity in Sri Lanka. Now, Buddhists, of course, all the Buddhists are Sinhalese, but there were in history, they say that there were even Tamils who were Buddhists in certain parts of Sri Lanka. And coming to Hindus, of course, majority or almost all Hindus are Tamil, but there are also Sinhalese or Buddhists who also worship Hindu gods. Now, coming to Islam, most of them speak Tamil language. And Christianity, of course, the only religion with both Tamils and Sinhalese. So that is another ground that we have, positive ground that we have to build a relationship, build a better communities. Now, coming to action in general, we have Ministry of Buddha Sasana, Religious and Cultural Affairs. Ministry of Buddha Sasana, Religious and Cultural Affairs. Under this ministry, we have Department of Buddhist Affairs, Department of Hindu Religious and Cultural Affairs, similarly, Department of Muslim Religious and Cultural Affairs, and Department of Christian Religious Cultural Affairs. All these three religions come as a department under the Ministry of Buddha Sasana, that is basically Buddhism. So there are also positive areas that I would like to mention with regard to this ministry. Now, say, for example, major festivals of all religions are celebrated at the national level. These four religions have their major festivals. So they choose one particular festival and they make it a national festival where a lot of finance is given for this particular celebration. People are also support. Then distribution of books and uniforms to all Sunday school teachers by the department, by these departments, four departments for all four religions. Then they also conduct competitions for children, and these departments hold these competitions. Then funds are also allocated every year for renovation of churches and temples, and also to buy furniture, stationeries, and projectors, and so on. This is a positive area that we have with regard to this Ministry of Buddha Sasana, Religious and Cultural Affairs. Coming to other details, now in Catholicism or Christianity, we had struggled, especially during war. There were churches bombed, priests and religious killed and tortured, especially after 1983, major riots. So Catholic Church was suffering as a result of that, especially in the north and east. And there are also at present possibilities to negotiate and speak to the government and get things done. But in 2019, with the April 21st bomb blast, we Catholic Church or Christians were killed, Catholics were killed, over 250 persons were killed. And as a result of that, many injured and many children lost their parents. Certain persons simply left alone, losing all the members of their family. So this is another major issue that we have in Sri Lanka at present, because almost 2 years have passed, almost completing 2 years. And today, actually, at present, I'm in Kandy making my retreat. But today we had a special meeting of all the bishops in Colombo, called by the Bishops' Conference and the Cardinal Malcolm Ranjit, to speak on this particular issue, because the Commission's report is released, and Cardinal has the copy given by the government. And the findings of this Commission report is not very satisfactory. There are certain persons who are mentioned to be prosecuted. At the same time, there are also certain names of even politicians that are not mentioned and sidelined. So we had to discuss as to how to go further with regard to this, demanding justice for all, because these people who are affected always demand for justice for whatever that has happened in the past. Then with regard to Islam, especially after this bomb blast, there is a lot of agitation against the Muslims by the majority, and a lot of activities. Their activities are controlled, especially this COVID-19. No burials are allowed. All the bodies are to be cremated. But only recently, after a lot of pressure, even from the world community, international community, government allowed, and also putting a lot of restrictions. But they have found at present, last few days, found the land, and they started burying the bodies. And Hinduism, of course, Hindus in general, they are really going through struggle, because their lands were taken after war, especially during war. Their lands were taken over by the military, and after war, certain portion of their land are released, but still, with regard to religion and their activities, it's very disturbing, because Hindus have their places of worship, temples, statues, land, pond. They are sacred. But there were occasions where Buddhist monks entered these places, some of these places. Say, for example, I can name 3 places: Kurundur Hill, Nayar, Vadakkunari. These 3 places in the Mullaitivu district. They had entered the Hindu land that belonged to Hindus, Hindu temples, and started the archaeological excavation. So in the name of archaeological excavation, and mentioning that this is certain areas are of archaeological sites, no one is allowed to enter the land or own those lands. So that is another issue, serious issue, that is creating a lot of tension among communities. Correct. Thank you. Just a few sentences only. The major issue is Sri Lankan majority Sinhalese. They think that Sri Lanka is a Sinhala Buddhist nation. That is a huge issue that we have. And basing on that, they go about constructing temples and statues all over Sri Lanka. The other is after war, 30-year war, government did not seriously initiate reconciliation among communities. So these are the two major issues that we are facing. And if this is settled, then of course there'll be better understanding and peace among communities. If as long as majority think that Sri Lanka is singular Buddhist nation, nothing will happen unless they change that attitude and think of all the communities as Sri Lankan. We will not have peace in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Ms. Shireen Sharnura, could you begin?
So I'll just quickly add to what the Bishop talked about. The Tamil and Muslim kind of like community has been at the forefront of receiving end of continuous structural violence. So it has to be looked at something that has been happening for a prolonged period of time. And more recently also the Sri Lankan government has used Prevention of Terrorism Act to my knowledge to arrest 48 Tamil youth just to commemorate the dead people on last year November. And over 300 Muslims have been detained since the Easter bombing without even being charged. So the PTA abuse and also the ICCPR that's supposed to protect ethnic minorities is being now used against ethnic minorities who are talking against various forms of atrocities committed against them. One other thing I want to highlight is, during the height of pandemic on May 15, 2020, while the country was under lockdown, the commander of the Navy, acting under the instruction of the Defense Secretary, who is also alleged war criminal, established a Navy contingent to protect the Buddha Mahavihara. This is in the eastern coastal town. It is now seen as eviction of the Tamils and Muslims who have been living in that particular land. It's a 70-acre land that they have been inhabiting for a long time. And in certain parts of Sri Lanka, particularly where the ethnic minority lives, Sri Lankan government has been systematically taking away the livelihood opportunities that the minorities have been having. One good example is in Batikalo, where they brought in Sinhala settlers and driven away the Tamil cattle growers from their grazeland, and also like 3 islands of Jaffna, Tamils who inhabit those islands have been subcontracted to a Chinese company to generate electricity without even single consultation with the community. And also recent move of burying the Muslims, COVID infected Muslim dead bodies in Iranathivu is also another move to take away an island where the Tamil, predominantly Catholics, who really wanted to resettle after the war, and they went in and dug graves in the grazeland of these Catholic communities. So the Sri Lankan government is pitching the minority communities against each other, and also Sinhala community against the other minorities. And the other thing is President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has been using the pandemic to set up task force, the 3 task force that he has set up to control the pandemic, and also to manage archaeological and heritage management and build a discipline and a virtue society. And it's all Sinhala men, mostly military and Buddhist monks. So he is using his 20th Amendment power to bring in the military forces. So you might be able to understand this, because our president has been openly saying that it is a Buddhist land, and Sri Lanka, he's a president of the Buddhists. So the other thing that I want to highlight is about the evangelical minority religious community that has also been under attack for a long time. Like since 2015, 513 incidents of attacks against them have been reported. All of those incidents have been led either by singular mobs or the government, the officers themselves have been, 50% of the attack has been directly by the government state officers, either police or some other local authority officers. And the Sri Lankan Muslim community has been also under attack. They also use the pandemic to blame the Muslim community as a COVID carriers and introducing COVID, unpatriotic Muslims. So they use two of the government private channel to make Muslim community look very ugly with regard to COVID. And in that context, only the whole cremation issue came about. Over 300 Muslims have been forcefully cremated. And strikingly, when international community talked about it, when they were trying to lift it, the justice minister also brought in a ban on niqab. And now we are also dealing with many of the Muslim communities' rights being slashed because we got the burial right. So one has to look at allowing burial for COVID victims. By no means an indicator that everything is okay in Sri Lanka. It is far from that, because two state ministers have said, anytime we will bring in the cremation policy. And I thank you again for one and only accountability process that happened in Sri Lanka is the US banning Army Commander Shavindra Silva's travel to United States with his family. That made a huge impact on the victim community. And I think US government should continue with that. And you should also, I mean, your role in the drafting process is very important. And also US government should play a key role in getting as many as votes as possible. And also I want Congressman to pay attention to the High Commissioner's report, particularly with regard to accountability. She's talking about targeted sanction and also asset freezing. And that's something that we really wanted. And also the financial crime committed by Rajapaksa regime, if Treasury Department can investigate, that will be great. And I also want to raise an alarm. On the 4th of March, US Pacific Air Commander met with alleged war criminal against Secretary of Defense Kamal Gunawardena. US has to cut down any support that it wants to give it to Sri Lankan military. It should be something that they have to warn Sri Lankan military of doing various atrocities. And also, like, if possible, US government should bring Sri Lankan issue to the General Assembly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now we will go to Mr. V. Ravi.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, distinguished panelists and participants. Am I allowed to share the screen? Thanks very much.
Yes.
The current situation in Sri Lanka highlights the weak and vulnerable position of the government. Despite this, the government continues to challenge the international community and refuse to participate in the international mechanism upholding human rights, democracy, good governance, and stability. This slide is, I would move on to next slide due to the time constraint. The economic situation in Sri Lanka is very worrying. The current foreign debt obligations are around 33 billion. International sovereign bond repayments during the last 5 years, 6.7 billion. It's 20% of the current foreign debt obligations. Sri Lanka is struggling to repay this, and the commercial loans. That is in 2004, 2.5% of Sri Lanka's foreign loans has been increased now to, in 2019, it's 56% of the Sri Lanka's foreign loans, mostly international sovereign bonds. The Sri Lanka has a serious foreign debt troubles, which there are concerns of over defaulting debt and Chinese debt trap. moving on to the next slide. The problems in 2021, this year, is much more worrying. The foreign debt situation restricts of not do the government stand on not using the International Monetary Fund support raises serious concerns among the investors, lenders, and other economic actors. Extreme difficulty to raise money through international capital markets by issuing ISBs. It's not an easy option, looks almost impossible in the near term. So next, the tourism industry affected, which is 20% of the foreign revenue due to pandemic. Potential default may occur in debt repayments. And further, the assistance from China, that is, the Sri Lankan government is expecting $1.5 billion swap facility from China, and the second tranche of the foreign currency term financing facility from China Development Bank is expected early 2021. It is very clear that Sri Lanka is betting on China to avoid serious foreign exchange crisis. Further, currently the accountability mechanisms proposed by the Human Rights Council, either local, hybrid, or hybrid system, have failed. UNHRC has identified early warning signs and continuous deterioration of human rights. There are repeated cycles of violence during the post-independence period of Sri Lanka for the last 33 years. This has not been addressed by the international community. Continuous impunity in Sri Lanka, particularly the notorious Prevention of Terrorism Act was brought in 1978 onwards. This impunity is the major problem, and the disruption to the world order due to this conflict is one of the things to be so resolved. And moving forward towards the Sri Lanka's economy, its economy mostly dependent on the US, UK, India, European Union. It amounts to the export destinations of the manufactured goods of Sri Lanka are mostly to USA, 26%, UK 8%, and so on. In total, 63% of the manufactured goods are exported to West and its allies. And if we consider the tourism revenues, the Europe 55.4% and Americas 6.3%. It's again almost 62% contributed by the European American tourists. So these are the two sectors Sri Lanka is heavily relying on. But if Sri Lanka is not allowing, China is not allowing Sri Lanka for any expanded market. Sri Lanka owes China almost 10% of the debt. This is a debt trap, and it is increasing. If we look at this, the next slide, the effective leverages. What are the effective leverages we have now? It is all the UN mechanisms, either UNHRC or any other mechanisms, and application of universal jurisdiction, extraterritorial justice, that is travel ban, asset freeze, and so on. That is one aspect which can be considered by individual member states, unilateral actions. And targeted economic sanctions, there are possibilities of targeted economic sanctions. There are possibilities of stage by stage. If the intransigence continue, then the international community, particularly the US, European Union, UK, and its allies can strategize. So if needed, I can send my email address. There are certain research being done by British Young Forum, and we can share it with you for any future strategies, for the inclusion of any future strategy. And then elevating the UN process from UNHRC to General Assembly is another consideration. And there are several other options. If I am allowed to, I can go into the details, but now I can pause here for any questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Professor, you might go right ahead.
Wonderful. I'll do that. Thank you so much. And I'm really honored to appear here with all of these colleagues. And I really appreciate your, as a caucus, focused and sustained attention on this issue. I've watched some of the prior sessions, particularly involving Yasmin Suka and others discussing the transitional justice issues, and I'd like to associate myself with those recommendations given earlier. I recently edited a symposium that was putting a spotlight on Sri Lanka appearing before the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and I had a number of contributions to that symposium, so I'll also be drawing upon those remarks here, and I'll put the link in the chat if people are interested. Because our Sri Lankan colleagues have described so poignantly the worrisome state of affairs when it comes to ethnic and religious minorities in Sri Lanka, I thought I would amplify some of the recommendations that have already been stated this morning and describe more that what the United States can be doing, working with partners and allies in the United Nations and then elsewhere to effectively impose additional leverage on Sri Lanka, as has been advocated. As we know, the United States invested heavily in the work of the Human Rights Council prior to the Trump administration relinquishing our spot on the council. So we should maintain that constant pressure and that engagement, both bilaterally with respect to Sri Lanka itself and our partners, but also multilaterally within this current council session. The US statement at the council this month was a really welcome move, and it highlighted the importance of the new report coming out, the importance of having a strong resolution on Sri Lanka, but also the increased marginalization of ethnic minorities, the militarization within minority communities, the shrinking space for civil society and for journalists, independent media to operate unmolested, the pervasive lack of accountability for any of the rights violations dating back to the Civil War period, but also up till now in the present, the failure to make any tangible and credible progress on earlier pledges around building a genuine transitional justice process to lay the groundwork for truth, justice, and reconciliation within Sri Lanka, and the elevation and pardoning of individuals who stand accused of committing war crimes. Many of them now are operating in very high-level appointments, which makes it very difficult for bilateral engagement because we have the situation in which we see US officials hobnobbing or in photographs with individuals who stand accused of committing war crimes during the Civil War period. The Religious Freedom Roundtable has also drawn attention to worrisome new legislation that would criminalize or make otherwise unlawful conversion between religion. Again, running counter to Sri Lanka's domestic and international commitments to the free expression of religion. So the United States should use its influence with members of the Human Rights Council to ensure that the Council produces a strong resolution and builds upon earlier resolutions, rather than succumbing to the efforts of Sri Lanka with an assist from China and other rights abusers to produce a much weaker text. It's particularly important in this regard to get India on board because it has a strong influence in the region. The US should also continue to echo this message in bilateral and multilateral forum. Although Sri Lanka did stand up an Office of Missing Persons, it has not been given the legal powers or authorities it needs to be impactful. This is really the only place in the whole panoply of transitional justice mechanisms that Sri Lanka pledged to implement that has seen any forward progress. This should be the least controversial because it responds to the moral imperative of family members knowing the true fate of those who have been disappeared, and yet it doesn't have the authority it needs to be impactful. And so victims must continue to demand answers and justice. The U.S. also can do more to empower civil society organizations and lawyers, both within and without Sri Lanka, to engage in the documentation of human rights abuses dating back from the Civil War but up to the present, and also to represent victims in their efforts to achieve justice within Sri Lanka and elsewhere. And mention was made of the possibility of universal jurisdiction cases happening in foreign fora around the world, and that should absolutely be explored. Any transitional justice mechanisms, from criminal accountability to vetting, is going to require strong documentation and information. So it's vitally important that the United States find ways to capacitate these efforts to ensure that potential evidence is preserved if and when there's ever an opening for justice. Mention has also been made of targeted sanctions, and I think there is more that the United States can do here. Human rights activists on the ground confirm that the 2020 sanctions against General Savendra Silva have made a real impact. Silva is the current commander of the armed forces who stands accused of being involved in, through command responsibility, of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including extrajudicial killing in the final phases of the war. An obvious additional person for designation would be Kamal Kunaratne, the former commander who is accused of overseeing the execution of human rights advocates and also captured rebel forces in the final months of the war. He was appointed in 2019 to the Ministry of Defense. And likely what is no doubt a painful irony for Sri Lankan victims, C.A. Chandra Pranra is Sri Lanka's representative to the Human Rights Council. He is alleged to have been a member of a pro-government death squad that operated in the 1980s that targeted opposition figures, including the murder of a number of human rights lawyers. And we should not forget that the current president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, was a US citizen until he purported to announce his citizenship in order to run for high office. He too, we know, has been accused of war crimes as well and could be prosecuted under the US War Crimes Act, given that he was a US citizen at the time he acted. The Department of Justice should be encouraged to continue to collect evidence on him and to press charges if the opportunity presents itself. The US also should ensure that Sri Lankan soldiers are not included within US peacekeeping missions, given that there are credible allegations against them during the Civil War period, but also in other peacekeeping missions that have been deployed. Particularly, there are strong allegations of sexual violence for the Sri Lankan contingent that was working as peacekeepers in Haiti. Given the absence of accountability within Sri Lanka for these depredations of its troops, Sri Lanka should be considered disqualified from participating in any UN missions until it can show that individual perpetrators have been appropriately dealt with and that individuals have been vetted from their security and police forces. Sri Lanka needs to hold accountable those who would harm civilians on peacekeeping missions and offer reparations for the Haitian children who have been abused. Likewise, in reference to these DoD connections, military to military connections, the DoD should not ramp up its mil-mil engagement until Sri Lanka cleans up its internal ranks. Particularly now that Silva is the head of the army and is sanctioned, the US should not be engaging in mil-mil engagement exercises or training until we see some genuine vetting of perpetrators within the Sri Lankan military. Finally, I would say that activists on the ground also confirm that sessions like this and other forms of high-level US engagement that express solidarity with victims, with minority groups, and with the political opposition are vitally important to keep justice, human rights, and the rule of law at the top of the bilateral agenda with Sri Lanka. So if US officials are meeting with Sri Lankan counterparts, they should also be sensitive about how this is portrayed and make sure that they are reaching out to civil society activists, opposition members, etc. So I'll rest there and I really look forward to the Q&A period. Thanks so much for including me in this important gathering.
Well, good. Hey, thanks for all the presentations. Very informative. Obviously, lots to be concerned about. It seems like to me that we are moving in the opposite direction from where we started back in the 2012, 2013 timeframe under the Saracena government, where we had such optimism. Didn't take long for water to be thrown on the campfire, that's for sure. Okay, let's get into Q&A. If you have a question, let's type it into the chat room. I'm going to be monitoring that, and I will call on each individual that asks a question. Looks like we have about 13 minutes or so
Yeah, let me
to
speak.
take questions. So if you could ask your question succinctly and the answers pointedly, that'd be a big help. Any questions?
Congressman, thank you very much. This is Sam Elangovan. Thank you both for organizing and participating. I have a question for Professor Beth. Professor, we know the people who are in power in Sri Lanka and their character. The only language they respect is probably targeted economic sanctions. Will you agree with that? And if you agree, please, can we give a timetable on enforcing what they agreed to? And if they don't perform, there should be such and such sanctions. Is that possible? And can we take a lead on that?
Absolutely. I think the current resolution that's being considered before the Human Rights Council should absolutely re-articulate all of the pledges that Sri Lanka has made in the past in terms of promoting justice and accountability for the crimes committed during the Civil War, but also up until the present. And to the extent that, I don't know whether the council would be willing to put actual timelines on there, but certainly I could imagine getting language that would require seeing real concrete progress. And our Department of Treasury, which is responsible for the targeted sanctions, should be encouraged to track and follow the degree to which there is progress. I think many believe it will be unlikely, unfortunately, and so should be teeing up those sanctions designations. To the extent that individuals have information about others who may be less high profile, who might be subjected to targeted sanctions, those can be fed into an organization called Human Rights First, which is helping to organize the non-governmental and civil society community to make effective appeals to the Office of Foreign Asset Controls within the Department of Treasury, which controls these targeted sanctions. And so you can share information with Human Rights First. They can then help to create these packages of all of the information that's required to do sanctions and share that with our Treasury Department. So I encourage people in civil society to think about how to feed information into that process.
Thank you very much.
Our second question comes from Avis Sri Jayanatha. She says, I understand that the UK holds the pen in writing the new resolution on Sri Lanka at the Human Rights Council this month. What can you share with us, Mr. Ravi, about the new resolution?
Okay. The current resolution is very worrying for those victims waiting for justice for so long, and their expectation after the High Commissioner's report was so high, and the current draft, revised draft, also has some further strengthening. Because some further strengthening, what, on our opinion, the first and foremost, it restricts any future international criminal proceedings by restricting it in member state. That is, as applicable by universal jurisdictions only. So we need a clause to open it up for any future international proceedings, and periodic reporting is very much required, because it's only after a year there is a reporting by High Commissioner. So that is one. And some way of taking this, elevating this to General Assembly. It is something very important, at least the reporting procedure, not any action. The reporting procedure has to be elevated to General Assembly. So these are fundamental, and the dedicated, the current proposal has to be further strengthened as a dedicated mechanism by the High Commissioner's Office. Thank you.
Professor Van Schaak, can you expand on what you think the U.S. can do at the UN Human Rights Council to help get a strong resolution passed?
Yeah, obviously we have more limited influence because we did give up our spot on the council somewhat inexplicably. Even though it's not a perfect body, it's a body in which we can be influential. It's a multilateral gathering of states that are concerned with human rights issues. And so we should be working to improve that system. I think there are a number of elements that should appear in this resolution, and Robbie has helpfully outlined some of them. Absolutely reiterating the pledges and the various elements. Potentially maintaining the investigative mechanism through the High Commissioner's office, and even potentially strengthening that mechanism to start moving from more of a generalized human rights reporting mechanism to something that would be more akin to what we might even describe as a criminal investigation, thinking about the individual responsibility of persons involved in human rights abuses and war crimes during the armed conflict. We've seen such mechanisms created by the Human Rights Council and elsewhere for Syria, for Myanmar, for Iraq, and so there's no reason why we couldn't create a more robust investigative mechanism for Sri Lanka. Those should be elements. Now, the US has to be doing this engagement. We're all virtual, and it's doing it a little bit from the sidelines, but the UK does have the pen, and there's a core group that's engaged here. And so the US can use its influence and its bilateral connections in Geneva to reach out to each of the members that are voting members, to encourage them to support a strong resolution and not to succumb to the pressure by Sri Lanka and China and others to weaken that text.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Our next question is from Francisco Ventura. He says, how can the US counter an already embedded Chinese investment in the country? And does the Sri Lankan people prefer engaging with Americans rather than with the Chinese? Let me answer the first part of that about how can the US counter an already embedded Chinese investment in the country? That's the tightrope that we constantly walk. It is very, very hard to use financial aid as leverage to influence the Sri Lankan government to do the right thing where human rights and transitional justice is concerned, when at the same time they have virtually an open door to the Chinese to do whatever they want them to do, to put them further and further in obligation to the Chinese. So that is a very, very difficult nut to crack. I think what needs to be striven for is convincing the Sri Lankan government that it is in their long-term best interest to be more engaged with the United States than with China, because we are a more fair and collaborative and conciliatory partner than the Chinese are going to be in that region. On the whether the Sri Lankan people prefer engaging with Americans rather than with the Chinese, Professor Van Schaik, do you have a thought on that as well? And by the way, folks, I've got to go to another meeting. So I'm going to turn the Q&A over now to Laura from my staff. She's going to monitor the questions from here on out. So thank you all for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Honestly, I would defer to my Sri Lankan colleagues. I don't have a sense of what the Sri Lankan people prefer, but I think your initial impulse that we are a fairer party, I think many states that have been a part of Chinese Belt and Road initiatives have soured on that. There were lots of promises made and expectations built, and as it turns out, they're stuck in, as has been described, a debt trap rather than seeing genuine development. And so I would hope that that would encourage Sri Lanka to think about the United States as a more helpful sovereign partner. But I defer to my Sri Lankan colleagues on that question.
Do you want to take the next question?
Avis, and it says, I understand the bishop was involved in organizing a march in the north and east involving wide swaths of the population from all.
I think the question is to the bishop. what were the demands of the P2P march? And that's
Yes.
what was asked.
Says, does the Sri Lankan people prefer engaging, or I'm sorry, please continue.
Yeah, the UN resolution, and of course, people were demanding for justice, and especially for UN to take up all issues related to the discrimination in Sri Lanka, and give more pressure to the government of Sri Lanka, so that there'll be better understanding and peaceful living among communities. So from the beginning till the end, they were insisting on in demands that they placed, we all placed to the UN to take up all these issues and give justice to the people affected in different forms. Like after war, there were people arrested and they went missing, and people like political victims, political prisoners, not released for many years, not even taken for trial. All these are the struggles and land issues. And because of taking over of these lands, and then lands or Buddhists taking over lands that belong to Hindu or Hindu temples, and the Tamil community is not able to do anything. Even the members of parliament, Tamil members of parliament, they are able to speak even in parliament, but still they are very much restricted. So only international community can intervene and do something. That was the demand from this particular P2P process.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is for Ms. Saror. It says, the Sri Lankan government and China are pressing to remove paragraph on forced cremations from the Human Rights Council resolution. What is your opinion and the current status on this?
So with regard to forced cremation operation of paragraph 8, they have been asking, not only China, Pakistan has been in the front line asking it to be removed. It's also dangerous because Pakistan has a full hand on the OIC countries, including the OIC countries that are members of HRC. So we Muslims have been lobbying, and US has taken a stand on keeping the operational paragraph 8. And we also managed to put Muslims into operational paragraph 7. We really, I mean, as Muslim community, there has been quite a lot of lobby across OIC countries also with regard to ongoing atrocities committed against the Muslim community. And we see that the burial issue being kind of revised is as a temporary issue. So that's why it's very important that these paragraphs stays, and we are lobbying very heavily the countries that are drafting the co-groups and others also. And with regard to what do the people think about China, is that depending on whom you're asking this question. And I see the majority community in this country is a bit blind with regard to Chinese investment. So if you look at the East Container Harbor, the takeover by Indian company, the way that the community protested, the Sinhala labor force protested, it was heavily pumped by the money was pumped to protest. I mean, the entire trade unionist got money from China and protested to prevent India taking over the East Container Harbor. So it's very interesting how the Sinhalese have acknowledged the Chinese investment in without even understanding how it comes with. But having said that, there is little bit of awareness within the civil society, South civil society about it. But it will take long time for Sinhalese to understand what China is doing in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
But don't forget about that lady.
Any, while we're at it, let me just mention that Ms. Renita Ganaraja from Sri Lanka today was awarded a Women of Courage Award winner. She, of course, is a human rights activist and lawyer. And I think she may be very well on the briefing today. But at any rate, we want to congratulate her And if she is on, I'd like to ask if she would like to make some comments in terms of our acknowledgement of her presence, but also her congratulations in terms of the work that she has done, and it is being recognized. So, Ms. Renitha, are you on?
Hi.
Yes.
Good morning to you all.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for congratulating me for the award. And thank you, Grace, for inviting me to participate in this event. Maybe I think in the next meeting, I maybe share some more issues which I'm dealing with in the ground level. But for me, it's like, as Shreen said, and the bishop add with the points on like what the ground situation in Sri Lanka. So I would like to add one more point here, like the question of independence of judiciary, which has been affected very heavily after the 20th Amendment, which been made very recently, where the president has been given more power to appoint the judges of higher level courts from High Court to Supreme Court, which prominently affecting the sense of rule of law and independence of judiciary, where the cases in relation to rights violations will be put in a corner, and then it can be dragged to a danger kind of zone where the victims have the last faith on the justice. So say like if you take up like last 1 year, there are much more number of cases which have been filed for bribery, fraud, and then financial crimes against the present regime, which have been like removed from the courts, and all the accused who have been indicted and then like charged under criminal procedure codes have been released without any conditions. And also like travel bans were removed, and then their properties were released. But since there are a number of arrests which have been taken place under the ICCPR Act, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights Act, which is being heavily used these days, because I'm receiving every day like minimum number of like 3 cases from my office across the island, where the minority communities who are being taken in by the Terrorist Investigation Division. So that needs to be taken in the resolution itself, where we have to say like the arbitrary arrest detention should be stopped by the Sri Lankan government, where the people have been like detained without any case process, using the pandemic situation. Maybe I think this is what I really wanted to add on, like I can take it up and then more points in the next meeting. Thank you for giving me the opportunity and then congratulating me. Thank you so much.
Thank you indeed. And we'll just go back, and we're still open. We've still got a few minutes before I have to run off to vote.
Congressman, I believe Mr. Ravi would like to add a few things.
Yes, go right ahead.
Yeah. Regarding the question for the effective leverage of economic sanctions, the Sri Lankan government is heavily relies on the West. That is more than 63% manufacturing goods are being exported to US, 26%, and the rest is to EU and UK. That is one of the leverage. And again, the majority of the tourists are from the European Union, America, UK, that is 62%. And the trade deficit, balance of trade is, whereas the China is providing market only 2% as opposed to 63% of the West. So they are not going to increase the market or allow the market to Sri Lanka. Whereas after the end of the war, they increased their exports to Sri Lanka, and currently it reaches to over $4 billion per year, and that is almost 20% of the total imports from other countries. So China is using Sri Lanka as a channel to grow by earning export coming from the West in a concessionary tariff, that is GSP plus, and that is now channeled through Sri Lanka to China. So economic sanctions is another leverage to control this Chinese domination. And what we see, the recent investments will make sure that China has some kind of legitimacy to further influence, and it will be very much of a concern for the stability of the region. Thank you. So the application of sanctions can be considered on a stage-by-stage because the entire market, the whole majority of the market Sri Lanka is expecting the market from West, but imports much of the products from China. So this has to be balanced. Thank you.
Let me ask you, is the reliance upon Chinese resources influencing the government's relationship relative to the civil rights and human rights of the citizenry?
If I understand the question, Congressman, Chinese helps Sri Lanka by providing loans with high interest rates, but they don't attach any strings to that. There is no human rights or other values. So it is an easy right for Sri Lanka to do anything and extract loans from China. Whereas the international community, particularly the democratic countries like West, will consider values for any future concessionary loans. Have I answered your question?
Yes, because I was just, and I can see how the leadership, but the real onus really gets back to the Sri Lankan government. That is the governance of the country and what the government does, notwithstanding its economic plight or its economic situation, that the economics may influence it, but it's not required. It seems to me that and it's still the government's responsibility and opportunity to make whatever decisions it makes relative to human rights and its treatment of the citizenry.
Yeah, the deteriorating economic conditions in Sri Lanka is very worrying because of the tourism and other conditions. Sri Lanka, it is expected that Sri Lanka will further find it difficult to manage its payments back to those who get a loan. So if using this market, this export market as a potential leverage international community can demand or request Sri Lanka to adhere to the values accepted by the international community. That is one of the subject matter we can go into detail in any other discussions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm looking up at the clock, but I think it's been a very fruitful discussion. Representative Johnson has had to leave already, but just know that we are prepared to be as actively engaged as we can possibly be. There have been times when I've thought that conditions were improving, that things were getting better, but listening to some of what we're hearing, it seems as though it's been like a dance we call the Watusi. 2 steps forward, 2 steps backwards. And rather than moving, you're not getting very far. And that's the way it seems to me things are. So we are prepared to stay engaged, to stay involved. I see some, what we call in this country, of course, activists. That is people who just remain committed and dedicated to the proposition and the idea that things can change. And so for the individuals that I've been working with for a long time, I say just keep the faith and keep working and keep believing, and we'll keep working and keep believing with you. So have a wonderful day, and I'd say this hearing is adjourned, even though I don't have a gavel here. I'll just adjourn it on my desk. Thank you all very much, and it's been a good morning. Thank you.